Good afternoon once again. We are going into our next session. It's really a beautiful day. We are having very, very captivating sessions. The speakers are very interesting, and it is generating in us a lot of interest to do more. At this point in time, let me introduce to you our next speaker. Is Maria Dolores Fernandez. She is the president of the Citizen and AIDS Committee in the Principality of Asturias. And our presentation today is Signs and Links of Violence in Women and Girls with HIV and AIDS. Maria, take the floor.
Since we first found out about HIV/AIDS and AIDS, the number of HIV-positive girls and women has increased all over the world. The incidence of the HIV/AIDS pandemic has led to an outcome of more women living with HIV/AIDS than men. The number of new cases of women and girls due to HIV has stabilized, and the number of deaths linked to AIDS has been reduced in the world at large. Stopping the epidemics and the response to the needs of women and girls depend on the region, the country, the age, and the population group they belong to. The discriminating aspect of the pandemics can be seen here. In 2014, out of the 34.3 million adults of 15 and older living with HIV/AIDS in the world, 51% of them were women. Out of the 3.9 million young people from 15 to 24 years of age living with HIV/AIDS, almost 60% of them were women and girls. If we look at the approximate cases, approximate figure of 1.8 million new cases in people 15 years and older in the world, women and girls became 48%. Young women have a negative correlation with HIV/AIDS, as there were 56% of new cases of those between 15 and 24 years of age. 42% of deaths related to AIDS-related deaths of people 15 years and older, were deaths of women and girls, and 75% of these deaths happened in sub-Saharan Africa. If we look at the data from sub-Saharan Africa, we see that women between 15 and 24 years of age have 8 times more chances than men to be HIV positive. In Asia, in total, women show an increasing proportion in HIV/AIDS infection rates. It has increased from 21% in 1990 to 35% in 2000. We have to speak about the vulnerability of women when we speak about HIV/AIDS. There are many issues or conditions that make her vulnerable. First, biologically, physiologically, the extension of the genital mucosa is larger, and therefore women are more exposed to HIV/AIDS, and then there's more potential contact, and semen has a higher viral load than vaginal fluid. And from an epidemiological point of view, that's also true. The partners are usually older, the men are usually older, and they usually have more sexual partners than the women. They also have social vulnerability. They usually power patterns and domination patterns of men against women in terms of the economy, social and political participation, limit the chance of women to have power to make decisions over their own bodies, health, sexuality. And we have a clear example of this when we look at the difficulties that women have to bargain when they want to use a condom, when they want their partners to use a condom. These social partners also limit women in the knowledge of their bodies and the knowledge of their rights and the exercise of their rights. There's also cultural vulnerability. Some concepts about love, romanticism, fidelity also lead to risk practices, thinking about false safety. For example, the idea that having a single stable partner will stop HIV/AIDS. In our association, we always say that love doesn't protect, condoms do. When we speak about violence and transmission risk of HIV/AIDS, studies consistently report a statistical association between violence experiences and HIV/AIDS. We have different forms, specific forms of violence that are of a direct risk for HIV transmission. We have sexual assault. This increases the vulnerability for HIV/AIDS infection in girls and women, both directly and indirectly. Directly, sexual assault may lead to trauma and tears in the tissue, and this, of course, increases the risk of HIV/AIDS infection. And this is worse for young women and for girls whose reproductive tract is not mature. Then the threat of sexual assault reduces the possibilities of women and girls to negotiate a condom or refusing to have sex without one. Sexual assault can also increase the trend to have risk sexual behaviors in the future, such as unprotected sex, multiple partners, drug abuse, or sex work. In many contexts, the stigma linked to sexual assault may lead to women and girls, may hinder that women and girls look for health psychological support. Sex under coercion. Girls who are forced to have sex under coercion are have more chances of being HIV positive. At world level, between 7 and 48% of young women and girls explained that the first sexual experience was under coercion. Same as for sexual assault, sex under coercion many times indicates that there is an unequal power relationship, and this relationship limits the possibility of women telling their partners to use a condom and therefore protect themselves against HIV/AIDS. In some parts of the world, elderly men seduce girls to have sexual favors in exchange of food or gifts, prefer to exploit those whom they think are virgins and therefore seronegative or HIV negative. If these men do not use protection, then they endanger those girls in terms of becoming HIV positive. Teenage girls who have had sex under coercion are also more likely to have not used condoms and have unwanted pregnancies. Violence in an intimate partnership, in that case, the power inequalities in sexual intercourse is also linked to risk of HIV/AIDS transmission. For example, when there's violence in the partnership, this fear of violence may hinder that women and girls bargain for condoms to be used, even if they suspect that their partner may be HIV positive. This is particularly dangerous as abusive men are more likely than non-abusive men to have several partners and to have symptoms of STDs. A study used data from 96 countries to show that women who are in a violent partnership have double the chance of becoming HIV positive. Early marriage. Due to biological factors, young wives are more vulnerable physically than other elder women to get STDs and HIV. This danger is increased because young girls have less chances than older women to negotiate safe sexual practices. A study in Rwanda found out that 25% of female teenagers who were pregnant at 17 years of age or below were HIV positive, though many of them reported that they had sex just with their husbands. According to the study, the lower the age of intercourse and the first pregnancy, the higher is the incidence of HIV/AIDS infection. And then human trafficking, that's another report. We have pandemics of STDs and HIV have increased the demand for sex with girls because they are less likely to be infected. Until we have better data about HIV/AIDS and human trafficking, we know that sexual exploitation is still a high-risk factor for HIV/AIDS transmission.
Mutilation or female genital mutilation can also cause infections and HIV, sometimes because the procedure happens without hygiene, and also because a dry vulva has a higher chance of suffering from infection during intercourse if their partner is HIV positive. There are harmful traditions worldwide that make violence against women and children more intense and that can enhance HIV transmission. For instance, polygamy. In most of the planet, we have polygynia as the most common form of polygamy. Unprotected intercourse with many different partners is a risk factor for HIV transmission. And in cases of polygynia, the husband or the male partner may never use a condom. Also, wives given as part of the heir when a husband dies. Those cases often entail power relationships where a woman or a girl may be pushed to accept this practice. Sometimes forced intercourse is involved as well. Those unequal power relationships may stop these girls and women protecting themselves from HIV infection. With widows, we find that sometimes they're forced to have sexual intercourse as part of a cleansing ritual after a death in widow inheritance. Intercourse often happens unprotected, which is why HIV transmission happens in a situation of unequal power. These girls and women are made to accept intercourse without a contraceptive, without a condom. Normally, property is inherited on the paternal line in families. Women who inherit a property may be evicted or have their in-laws take their properties. HIV death of a husband, for instance, may end up with a woman being evicted or having their property taken away from them, which is very harmful for the widow and her children. They are financially vulnerable and then at a greater risk of transmission. Also, problems with education and training makes women more vulnerable to HIV. There is a study that has proven that women with at least primary education have at least threefold likelihood of knowing the chances of transmission from mother to children. Education prevents transmission, promotes the use of condoms, so it is very much advisable. So it's women mostly who are victims of HIV transmission. Women express that they have been victims of violence after they have made it public that they're HIV positive. Because of that, they're reluctant to be tested or to seek treatment or support. In our environment, injected drug addictions also discriminated women more so than men, suffering from violence, sexual exploitation, to try and access the necessary resources or to keep their partners. This emotional dependence from other addicts made these women also fall prey to drug addictions. Very often we hear that women are mostly vectors of HIV transfer. They mostly worry about their partners, their children, their customers, much more so than themselves. They're much more vulnerable than to HIV. This type of discourse reproduces roles for women that don't let them perceive themselves as vulnerable, don't stop them from protection. They're isolated, they're dependent, because of previous situations of gender violence. All of these would be factors that would make them matters worse. They have an image of themselves as pollutants, which reinforces their self-perception as negative and inefficient. Many women understand that if they're victims of HIV, they will not be loved, they will not be desirable, and this is something that abusers use against women with HIV. Another reason why they're more vulnerable have to do with changes in their body because of facial lipoatrophy and lipodystrophia, which are consequences of some retroviral treatments. Lipodystrophy has a very negative effect in the access to jobs, in their social relations, in the way they relate with their families, and the way they perceive sexuality and their self-image. This stigma is very much present in society, in the work environment, and we see that HIV positive women tend to be poorer than the rest. When new medications are tested, we see very interesting results. If we look at patients included in these tests, only 20% of them are women. Unfortunately, we have no studies that study the efficiency or toxicity of these medications on women in particular as different from men. We also find a high rate of women who are given HIV diagnosis with very low CDs. This means that treatments don't take into account particular traits that women may have because of physiology, cultural issues, hormonal changes, or physiology. Right now in Spain, over 80% of new diagnoses in women were due to heterosexual transmission. And this includes 50% of women who are diagnosed late. Progress that has been made in these treatments and diagnoses have managed to have HIV now as a chronic pathology with quite normal life expectancy, with reasonable quality of life, with low transfer of the virus. And yet that's only the theory, because socially the perception is very different, and HIV women continue to suffer from these effects. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maria, with such a detailed presentation that is not only reflecting on one side of our world, but it is reflecting the whole world. I think at this point in time, let us have some comments or questions to the presentation. Comments or questions? Do we have comments? On one hand, I think I just want to say one thing. What Maria has said is really something that is shaking the world. It is something that is really shaking also the sub-Saharan Africa. We are having more people dying every day. People dying because of ignorance, people dying because of poverty, and people dying because of our culture structures and the culture beliefs. She has mentioned a lot of the cultural practices which are contributing to this. And just to add on that, there is one culture which is also called Fisi. Fisi significa hyena. Hyena is a hyena. In this culture, if one family do not have a child, cannot manage to have a child, they will hire a man from another family secretly. So this man is hired and sleeps with the wife of this man in another family, so that when this woman has a child, it should look like this child is for this man. So that is also another culture which is contributing a great deal to the spread of HIV and AIDS in most of African countries. I'm sure we have a lot of comments. I'm sure we have some questions to the presentation of Maria Dolores. Comments? Sometimes if we have no comment or no questions, it means the presentation is so good, so clear, that we don't even know from where to ask. Or we have heard nothing and we don't know if we have to ask anything. I think it has been a very wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you.
I think let us give a very big hand. Thank